I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing for the past couple of years, actually in collaboration with my colleague Javier Arpa, who's here in the audience. And what I want to do is try to talk about that research through this lens of citizenship. So I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of step back from some of the work that I've been doing and think about it in different terms via the lens of this conference. Some of you might be aware of this. There was an exhibition that was staged in New York at the Museum of Modern Art beginning in the spring that showed the work of the Congolese architect, or Congolese artist, Botis Isaac Kingalese. And the title of the exhibition was called City Dreams. And it was this sort of collection of these really amazing, sort of brilliantly imagined cityscapes that you see here. And the New York Times, in reviewing the article, or reviewing the exhibition, said that these were among the most distinctive and ambiguous creations in the histories of sculpture, architectural model making, and the decorative arts. Frankly, praise that's as unrestrained as the artworks themselves. I think what's sort of interesting about these in some ways is that there's really little question as to sort of the spectacle of these things. They're interesting for art connoisseurs, they're interesting for young children, but I don't bring this exhibition up in the context of this event because I want to talk about the merits of them as art projects. I mentioned the exhibition because of what I see as its usefulness as a kind of lens to consider the subject of this essay, or actually this presentation, which is the ongoing rapid physical urbanization of the African continent. And in particular, what Kingalese articulates is the intent of his work relative to the broader questions of citizenship at the core of this event. As the call for proposals for this publication points out, citizenship as an idea is rooted in a sense of belonging. Optimistically, we can understand that as citizenship suggesting a kind of fraternity or a shared experience, but pejoratively, we can understand it as a kind of categorization, the implication of separation and distinction. Inevitably, citizens of one thing or one place are understood as being distinct from the citizens of something else. These identities really manifest themselves in many countless ways, but in terms of the contemporary urbanization, they most often manifest themselves in the form of desire, of aspiration, and of want. And we might even argue that much of contemporary global economic policy is actually geared toward this idea of fomenting want, defining the possessions of things as a means of belonging. Not just possession as the individual, but possession at the level of a city, possession at the level of a state, and possession at the level of an entire society. As I've discussed elsewhere, as far back as the mid-60s, economists and sociologists have been trying to evaluate and characterize the relative power of cities, of urban environments. Initially, these were sort of how the city related to the area around it, its kind of countryside. Eventually, it sort of get into a kind of discussion of cities' relationship to one another globally in terms of their political power, sort of Washington and Moscow, for example. And eventually sort of developed into a kind of question of corporate influence, economic influence, rather than governmental as we start to think about the power of cities. Eventually, sort of methods of quantitative analysis were actually established, which allowed for what were considered to be objective evaluations of a city's influence or its power. And the first significant example was actually established here in the UK, called the Globalization and World Cities Research Network. These rankings or these evaluations were based on so-called command and control activities. And what's interesting about them is they generated a whole sub-industry of other rankings, rankings that imply the possibility of a kind of objective assessment of the value and the status of a city. Not only the ability to objectively evaluate them, but the potential to ascend those rankings if cities were to follow the guidance implied by their quantification. The orientation and the kind of neutrality of these rankings dramatically varies. They emerge from sources as diverse as transgovernmental organizations like the UN or the OECD, accounting and multinationals like Mercer or A.T. Kearney, and even media outlets like Monocle or The Economist. And what I would argue is that what this proliferation of rankings suggests is, and it's really created, whether intentionally or not, is a kind of standardized notion of what the contemporary 21st city should look like, what it should be comprised, what it should be composed of, and really ignoring the particularities of geography, culture, climate, and history as we start to think about the city itself. The purpose of these rankings, really beyond burnishing the reputations of the institutions that are behind them, is this possibility of suggesting that you can elevate political economic status by subscribing to a set of priorities, and the priorities that these very rankings are actually based. The things that one could argue that impatient capital is looking to invest in and extract value from. So the sort of standardization is obviously rooted in the kind of neoliberal model that was mentioned in the previous presentation. What's interesting about the rankings as well is that there's a kind of correlation between physical form and the kind of status of the things that are being evaluated. So you start to establish sort of urban growth models that become quite familiar and start to become things that are borrowed or tried to be replicated elsewhere. So you've heard, for example, the China model or the Dubai model or the Singapore model. And so there are examples where in the case of Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, there's actually a plan, Kigali 2040, which is predicated on actually transforming that city into the kind of African version of Singapore in a relatively compressed period of time. Whereas Singapore took over 50 years, half a century to kind of reach its certain global status, the plan proposed for Kigali is to do this in 15 years. And what's interesting about this plan is that it's actually being advised by the Singaporeans, by consultants based in that country who are involved in the development of that project. So literally exporting the model of city building into a context that really has very little to do with the source of that particular model. This has led to a phenomenon which is really the subject matter of my ongoing research that I refer to as speculative urbanization. And this is something that has to do with the kind of construction of infrastructure and settlement that's motivated by political and economic interests as opposed to market or demographic demand. It doesn't have to be physical. In some cases, it can actually be procedural. So whether it's sort of rezoning of a piece of land, the reparcelization, or the approval of a plan, all those things have an effect on the value of property, and they have an effect on the kind of the significance of that piece of territory. The work that I'm going to show you today, the projects I'm going to sort of show you quickly today, are all existing at the perimeter of existing settlement or in entirely greenfield sites. So real estate speculation, which is sort of part of speculative urbanization, that exists within the core of the city is not something, I'm interested in it, but it's not part of this research. But the focus area is really happening at the edge or in the kind of greenfield areas. The reason that I'd become interested in this was prior work related to the kind of the global financial crisis in 2008, and in particular looking at the events that occurred in Spain during this period. And while a lot of the focus on that has been on the kind of economic consequences of that moment in time and the kind of things that led up to it, my interest is really in the kind of social implications and the environmental implications that go along with this sort of urbanization and the urbanization's role in these financial crises. I think to an extent we're seeing a kind of replication of those events again, a sort of bubble that's beginning to form. And although I'd love to sort of discuss the economics of it, I'd rather sort of use this as a lens to sort of pivot to the kind of discussion of urbanization in Africa and my sort of ongoing work. In a video that accompanies the MoMA exhibition that I began with, Kingalese casually declares that a city without high-rise buildings is a dead city, a non-existent city. It's boastfulness that's consistent with the artist, but it's actually exceptionally prophetic as a kind of declaration. Because as I sort of have come to argue, there's an increasingly held belief by many of those involved today in the shaping of future urban form, that is, if your city doesn't subscribe to the priorities outlined in those rankings discussed above, if it's not comprised of certain things that have been set as best practices, if it doesn't aspire to a particular identity, it's seen as not being of a particular value. It's understood as being deficient in some way. And the result, of course, is the kind of flattening of urban form, the loss of cultural identity, the loss of geographic identity, the loss of climactic identity. I make this declaration or this assertion having spent the past few years kind of identifying and documenting over 120 proposals for new town projects across the African continent. These are spread across about 32 countries within the continent. And I will acknowledge that there's a kind of danger in sort of talking about any land mass or anything as large as Africa. Obviously, there's a huge range of geographies, there's a huge range of cultures, But what you'll see in the kind of examples that I'm about to show you is the kind of uniformity with which the city is being thought of and the city is being proposed, not taking into account any of that variation that's present within a landmass that is this large. Each proposal is over 300 hectares in scale. It shares a set of common characteristics that we could characterize it as a new town. And I'm just going to click through these really quickly because I think what you start to see is there's a certain currency to the way that global real estate works, in terms of the way that it presents the projects, in terms of the formats that it selects, in terms of the abundance of green, regardless of where these projects actually are taking place, and the kind of standardization that starts to become apparent in the way that we start to think about future urban form. As part of the exercise of this research, although these cities all fall under the category of sort of new towns, we went through the exercise of starting to categorize them and starting to distinguish them in some ways in terms of the motivations behind them. And I just want to very quickly go through these motivations because I think they are interesting in sort of understanding why projects like these are undertaken. You have examples like national capitals where it's a very expressly an idea of political power. This, for example, in Equatorial Guinea. You have techno cities or industrial cities that are motivated about sort of capturing a kind of economic activity or trying to generate an economic activity. You have financial districts which are similarly motivated, sort of demonstrating the image of global economic status, whether or not that status has been achieved or not been achieved, places like Echo Atlantic and Lagos. And then you have middle-class housing. And middle-class housing in many ways is the most commonly pursued example of these new town projects. Middle class being a bit of a misnomer because many of the populations that these projects are supposedly intended for are really not able to access these projects in any meaningful way. There are some examples of social and subsidized housing, but they're much more limited and much fewer. Some that have been quite successful are those that have been undertaken outside of Addis Ababa. And then, of course, you have sort of tourist and entertainment enclaves. You have luxury housing that has been pursued. And in very few cases, Kigali being one of them that I mentioned before, there is redevelopment of the existing center of cities or the existing urban form. But that redevelopment tends to be the raising of it as opposed to the kind of the incremental transformation. And then finally, the last category is what we've kind of referred to as greenfield megacities. And these are cities that are being proposed for 15,000, 20,000 hectares or more, sort of massive transformations of territory that really are highly likely ever to be achieved. They're really kind of propositions to create attention and to draw foreign investment into a place. And so you see, for example, some of the infrastructure that's been constructed as part of the Capital Cairo project outside of Cairo. What is really interesting about these is they share a set of familiar deficiencies across the examples. They're geographically isolated, despite sort of articulating a desire for mixed use and vibrancy. They tend to be very monofunctional, dominated by housing. Access is limited both in terms of physical distance, but also in terms of its economics. They're simply too expensive for the populations that they're being built for to afford, or supposedly being built for. There's an absence of culture, there's an absence of public amenity, and there's a kind of wildly overscaled infrastructure, an infrastructural burden that's often obligated by the state to provide. So not only is the sort of land being sold off, but the state is incurring debt as a means of providing the infrastructure for these developments. So you look at this and you say, knowing all the problems, knowing the past history of this, why do these projects keep coming to be? And again, I think as the previous presentation noted, it is economic. It's about a sort of desire to project a kind of status and a sort of create power, both in terms of its impressions domestically, but also in terms of its impressions abroad. Looking to attract foreign investment, looking to create low-skill, high-wage jobs, sources of revenue either through taxes or the sale of land, but this idea of projecting modernity, projecting an image of modernity and accomplishment through the construction of the city has become something that is highly prevalent and something that is becoming an increasing concern because of the social impact of it as well as the environmental. If we return back to the kind of body of work in the MoMA exhibition that Congales was responsible for, we can sort of describe it as being highly aspirational, right? It's expressive of a kind of vision of urbanity that has very little to do with the extant city. It's not about Kinshasa today, but it's about the kind of possibilities of the future. There's very little that's related to the physical landscape within the city itself, although there are cultural references, at least in his examples, or in his work. That said, how do we think about the examples of the 120 or so new towns that I've just shown you? They're not presented as aesthetic provocations. They're not exuberant exaggerations. They're not visionary utopias. They're actually presented to the world as being deadly serious. They're executed expressly for the purpose of extracting external capital and looking to extract value from a piece of land, a government, or a population. So while these projects are visionary, the new towns that are being proposed are quite the opposite. They're almost dystopian in their intent and in the kind of results that begin to emerge from them. I like to show this project because it's called Newtown, and that's literally what it is. But this is a proposal for a project in Kenya. And there's really no question that when we look at any of these individual 120 or so propositions, we can critique them for their generic qualities. We can critique them for their urbanistic tropes and their kind of wild greenwashing of the landscape that they drop into. We can question the delirious promotion of them as being for an emerging middle class when that middle class isn't able to access these endeavors. And we can question the rationale of the municipal and state governments for funding the infrastructures upon which these projects begin to rely. But where does the sense of urgency that I'm sort of arguing for come from in relationship to these projects? I would say that this urgency comes from looking at the historical examples of this kind of urbanization. Speculative practices like these are not new. They've been going on really for centuries, but most significantly in the sort of late 19th, early 20th, and now into the 21st century. And when we start to look at these examples, what we start to realize is there's the significant consequence increases as the scale of building increases. So the examples in sort of 19th and 20th century US context, like Florida and California, were nowhere in comparison to the scale of speculation seen in Spain during the early 2000s, and certainly nowhere in scale in comparison to the scale of speculation seen in places like China that are ongoing. If we extend that to the scale of the African continent, we're talking about a dramatic transformation of territory and a dramatic transformation of society as a result of these urbanistic endeavors. So from my point of view, the issue is not so much the projects themselves that I'm questioning, even though many of them have sort of basic fundamental urban design faults. Rather, it's their potential, if not inevitable, social and environmental disruption that I think is most concerning about this kind of activity that we as designers and planners are centrally involved in. So just as a kind of way to begin to wrap up, I think it's worth sort of thinking about three primary questions. One being, who is the arbiter of the vision of the future city? Where does that vision emerge from? Is it the politicians? Is it the sort of the international consultants? Is it the population itself? How is the vision of the city shaped, and who's responsible for participating in that vision? In the construction of that vision, and sort of in talking about the examples that I've shown you today, one of the things that is suggested is the kind of implied abandonment of the existing city. In the African context, the existing city is often seen as being too complex, too burdened, too complicated to really deal with, and it's frankly much easier simply to move outside into an agricultural site or a greenfield site. So with the abandonment of the city, what role then do we have to think about landscape considerations? What role do they play in these projects? When I use the term landscape, I mean both cultural landscape as well as physiological landscape, and how they start to appear or not appear in these kind of urbanistic endeavors that we're talking about here today. It's quite interesting, actually, when you look at the projects because of the rhetoric that gets used. There's many references to environmental performance, there's references to ecology. Many of the projects are sort of rendered in this sort of lush landscape, regardless of where they're actually proposed for. The sort of arid plains get the same kind of green treatment as the kind of savanna. But the treatment of landscape is unfortunately superficial. And I would argue in many of these projects, the role of landscape in terms of the urban design of them is equally superficial, functioning as a kind of branding in terms of the projects. Rather, the majority of these settlements are simply being rolled out and stamped down on the peri-urban land within the African continent, really with little regard for the geographic or cultural characteristics that distinguish their destination. And so I'm going to skip that slide, but just to kind of end, I think, one of the things that I've started to discover through this research and through working on this project is the unnecessity of focusing on the outcome and focusing on the product of what is being proposed, but really thinking about the process of installation, the process of how these projects get rolled out. And so how do we begin to think about sort of ideas of contingency and adaptation built into our urbanization process, as opposed to focusing on the kind of image and the identity of that endeavor as a kind of priority within the work. So to conclude, with that ambition of engaging the process in mind, how does one consider the notion of citizenship in the context of an urban landscape that's in the process of becoming? Who are the citizens of this place, and how does one design for a population that may or may not actually ever arrive, as we've seen in many of these speculative examples throughout history? I would argue that a potential way forward is to extend the responsibility of citizenship beyond those who might reside in the place to those tasked with shaping that environment. To establish a sense of obligation and affinity that's suggested by Ken Olwig's notion of landship in the disciplines that are actually engaged with the manufacture of these future urban landscapes. Obviously, how one achieves this in the context of demands for the so-called instant city, the kind of examples that I've shown today, is difficult, but I would suggest that if the urban design disciplines continue to fail to acknowledge the kind of central role that this speculative urbanization tendencies play in the work that they're undertaking, we can only understand our activities as being complicit in the production of a potential economic, social, and environmental crisis that will really dwarf what happened in 2008. That the scale of what's being taken on in this context is much more broad and much more dramatic than even what occurred in the early 21st century, and as a result could have equally catastrophic, if not greater, consequences. Thank you.